Okay, I'll have to record. Someone should have reminded me. Okay, so I just gave a little bit of the history of the concept of a yahrzeit, the passing of a tzaddik, and the history of Hasidism till the time the Maggid was rich. And then, microphone is rattling. Oh, sorry, I think it's my hands on the table that are rattling more than the microphone. Is that better? Is that better now? Okay, so apparently. Okay, so we were talking about the Maggid Mezrich was the last centralized authority figure in the Hasidic movement. From then on, his disciples, 60 of his disciples, became the great leaders of the Hasidic movement, each in his own particular manner, each in his own particular area, mostly the Eastern Europe and Russia, and so on and so forth. The Maggid of the Rabbi Elimelech of Lizhensk was one of those students, and his domicile was in Lizhensk, which is in Poland, I believe. In any event, he had many students, the Chozeh of Lublin, Israel Koshnitz, Menachem Mendel Rimanov, and so on. But there's a story told about him, a very interesting story, which illuminates the teaching that we're going to give a little bit later on. The story is as follows. The Maggid Mezrich, just as many great Torah scholars, great biblical scholars, and not just biblical, but Talmudic and Kabbalistic scholars, etc., the Maggid Mezrich had students who would serve him for a certain amount of hours. We're talking about people who didn't usually sleep more than 2 or 3 hours a night. The Maggid Mezrich certainly didn't sleep more than 3 hours a night. So he was studying the entire day and the entire evening. And the students would called Shimush Talmidei Chachomim. It's a mitzvah. It's a commandment. It's a requirement that one serves and helps out a great saint or a great scholar or a great tzaddik, a righteous person, and so on. So Rabbi Elimelech of Lizhensk was one of the people who was scheduled to serve the Maggid Mezrich. He would bring him some books if he needed them. The Maggid Mezrich was actually crippled in his legs. He walked with canes, I think with canes. But his students would bring him what he needed. They brought him books. They brought him maybe a tea or something. Whatever it was that he needed. This is part of the education of a student, is to serve his master in some way or another. Obviously not like a slave, but just to help out. In any event, it was his turn to serve the Maggid Mezrich, and the Maggid Mezrich told him the following idea. He says there's a verse, as we all know, the verse in the Torah, in the Bible, which says you shall love your neighbor as yourself. Now, that's the usual translation. It's not the best translation, but it's a translation anyway. So the question is, what does it mean as yourself? You shall love your neighbor as yourself. So most of the commentaries, and this is in fact the law, requires that you are only obligated to show love towards those who are like yourself. In other words, in the same sort of situation, to the same degree of devotion, etc., etc. It doesn't have to be exactly like yourself, but in the general area of where you're holding, that's who you're obligated to really love. Now, the Baal Shem Tov came along and he said, we have to have love even to those, and we're talking about very scholarly people now, you have to have love even towards those who are very simple and plain and ordinary Jews. Plain and ordinary people who do not have learning behind them. They're simple people, and you have to love them equally as you love a scholarly person just like yourself. Along came the Maggid Mezrich, and he said to Rabbi Elimelech, that's what the Baal Shem Tov said, I'm telling you that you have to love even a person who is wicked. You have to even love a wicked person. Now, this is no small feat, to be able to love a person who is wicked, to be able to love a person who is, in a sense, I suppose you could say, in a sense, your enemy, because he completely stands against everything that you stand for. But nevertheless, you have to love such a person. Why? Why do you have to love him? Because after all, even such a person has a spark of godliness within them. Every soul has a spark of godliness. Otherwise, it wouldn't be there. The person wouldn't be alive. It wouldn't be in this world. And therefore, to bring out the spark of godliness, the only way that can be done to bring out the spark of godliness is through the idea of love, through loving the person, loving that spark of godliness and bringing it to the fore, bringing it out, making it emerge from its cocoon, so to speak, because that spark of godliness may be buried in layers and layers and layers of issues, of hatreds, of all kinds of problems, of, if you want to put it in this terminology, of sin. And therefore, it might be very difficult externally to love this person, but if you look for the godly spark within him, that is within him or within her, that in fact will bring out that godly spark into revelation, and the person can change dramatically and drastically, even overnight, if you know how to do what you're doing and you do it sincerely and with true love. In any event, that's who the Rabbi Elimelech of Lizhensk was, and that's what it was all about. This was part of his mission in life. Now, he himself was an extremely scholarly and austere kind of a person. He had a brother, Reb Zushia Vanipoli, was exactly the opposite. But Rabbi Elimelech did his very best to spread out the teachings of Chassidus as best as he could. And as I mentioned before, he had many students, many disciples, many who themselves became important Hasidic rebbes, and they spread out the teachings of the Baal Shem Tov and the Magen Rich, and so on and so forth. Okay, that was sort of all introduction. Now we get to the teaching that I wanted to share with you, the teaching of Rabbi Elimelech of Lizhensk, which is a very, very interesting teaching, and it is on a verse that speaks about the very wicked person whose name was Korach, Korach. Let me share a screen over here, and I will soon show you the verses that I want to look at. Who was Korach? Korach was actually related to Moses. He was related to Moses. I'm assuming everyone can see the shared screen, right? He was related to Moses. He was also from the tribe of Levi, the Levite tribe, as Moses was, Moses and Aaron. But for reasons that will become clear very soon, he stood in opposition to Moses. And this was the statement that he made at one point in time. So Korach, the son of Yitzhar was his father's name. Yitzhar, interestingly enough, is one of the words that we use for light, like Tzohorayim. Tzohorayim is the afternoon when the light is the greatest. That's Yitzhar. It comes from the same root. So meaning light. So Korach, the son of Yitzhar, ... because we don't have to read the whole sentence. Well, let me read it first in Hebrew, as I usually do. Vayikra Korach ben Yitzhar ben Kahas ben Levi v'dasam v'aviram v'yikalu al Moshe v'al Aharon v'yimru aleihem Rav lachem ki kol ha'elah kulam kadoshim v'sleichem Hashem u'madua tisnasu al kol Hashem. In other words, Korach took, literally. He literally took certain people aside, Dasan v'aviram, and 250 scholarly members of the Sanhedrin of the Jewish court, 250 members of the Jewish court, and they gathered against Moses and Aaron, and they said to him, enough, this is too much for you. For the entire assembly, all of them, every one of this assembly over here are holy, and God is amongst them. Why do you exalt yourselves over the congregation of God, or over the congregation of Hashem? Why do you exalt yourself? Now, why did Korach think that Moses was exalting himself? Moshe was a very, very humble man. In fact, the Torah itself says, Moshe he was the most humble man on earth, extremely humble. And all that he was doing was his duties. He was chosen to disseminate the teachings of God, the Torah, the Bible, And that's what he did. And he did it to the very best of his abilities. And we could say that he did it to perfection, basically. Why did they think that he was exalting himself over the congregation of God? Because there has to be leadership. And simply leadership does not come from below. It's not communism. Even in communism, there's a lot of leadership. But in theory, communism means that there's no leader and everyone is equal. We all know how that worked out and how that works out. It's completely a myth. Human beings are not designed in that way. In any event, there is a sort of a hierarchy of authority. In other words, Moses was the one that heard the word of God and he transmitted it to the Jewish people. He transmitted it, in fact, to the world. But he transmitted it primarily at that time in the desert to his fellow Jews who had just exited from Egypt during the Exodus. And Korach was having issues with this. So the Zohar explains the following. First of all, the word vayikach, that literally Korach took. What does it mean? He took that, he separated. This is the Aramaic translation. Targum Onkelos says the word vayikach in Aramaic is vitpeleg, to split apart. Then the Zohar says on this as follows. So Zohar says that the same idea of splitting things apart actually happened right at the beginning of creation in Genesis, in chapter 1, verse 6, where it says, Vayomer Elokim yehi or vayi or. So I'm sorry. Vayomer Elokim yehi rakia b'toch hamayim. There should be a rakia, a firmament in the waters. Vahi mavdil be'mayim l'mayim, and it will separate between the upper waters and the lower waters. Now, what do we mean by upper waters and lower waters? So this is in a very simple, straightforward sense. The lower waters would be the sea, rivers, lakes, fountains, and so on and so forth. That's the water down below. That's the lower waters. And the upper waters are the waters in the heavens, the waters in the firmament, the waters in the sky. In other words, the clouds and the atmospheric moisture that exists up above, and there's a separation between the two of them. Now, obviously, we're not talking only on a very simple, straightforward, lower level. We're not talking only in the world of the lowest component of the world of Asiya, which is the lowest spiritual world. The world, as everybody knows by now, are divided. There's four main worlds, four manifested worlds, which are called the world of Asiya, the lowest world, the world of Yitzira, the world of formation. So the next world up, the world of creation, the world of Bria, the third world from the bottom, and then the world of Atzilut, the world of emanation, the world of closeness, from the word Etzel, closeness, the world that is close to godliness. Then beyond that, there's another meta level called Adam Kadmon, the primordial world, the world which is not manifested in the same way that the other lower four worlds are manifested. In fact, real manifestation only begins from the world of Bria. Even the world of Atzilus is, to a certain extent, not manifested in the way of creation. It's not a created world. It's an emanated world. It's very different from a created world, which we've discussed many times on many different occasions. In any event, the Zohar says about this, that let there be a separation between water and water. Now, what did the Zohar mean? What was the idea that the Zohar was trying to explain, and why Rabbi Elimelech of Lizhensk used the Zohar to explain this concept, to explain what it is that Korach was doing? Okay, what does water represent? One of the things that water represents is the concept of delight. Water represents delight. Now, you might ask why that is, but there's a saying that that water sprouts or gives birth to, or however you would say it, to delight. In other words, come on, let's all face it. Getting in a hot tub or a hot shower or whatever it is, or a spa is one of the delights of life. Let's all face it. I do not use spas, but I do go to the mikveh on a regular basis. And the mikveh is purification process, but the water is usually pretty warm, and it's a delightful experience in any event. So water represents, in Kabbalah, represents the idea of delight. But in delight itself, there is more than one level. There's two levels, two types of delight. Now, even though there's actually many gradations, and it's not only really two types, there's many aspects of delight, of the delight of the soul, the delight of the Garden of Eden, for example. In the Garden of Eden, there's two levels, the higher and the lower level of the Garden of Eden. But nevertheless, between those two levels of the lower and the higher, which is just a general classification, there are many levels. And souls rise in the Garden of Eden, where they go to after passing on, the soul returns to its original pristine state. And it goes from level to level and from level to level, depending on its actions in this world and its subsequent actions and how much it learns, how much it absorbs in that world to come, in the world of the Garden of Eden. We could discuss the Garden of Eden on another occasion, perhaps in more detail, and explain it in greater detail. But in any event, Rabbi Elimelech of Lizhensk explained that the problem here was that Korach wanted to separate the higher delight from the lower delight. In other words, the delight in godliness, the divine delight, the delight of holy and spiritual things from the physical delights of this world. Now, we can understand that this is actually, to a certain extent, maybe a logical position. Obviously, physical delights of this world, like eating a pizza or something like that, or whatever it is, a good glass of wine, everyone has their own things that they enjoy. So to separate the physical delights from spiritual delights would seem to be, to a certain extent, a logical move. However, it is only logical if you don't understand what the physical delights are there for. One of the fundamental teachings of the Baal Shem Tov is that in everything, whatever there is that exists, it would not be able to exist without a divine spark within it. That divine spark is its life force. Now, if there is something that brings delight in the physical world, this divine spark, that divine spark is a messenger to the person to elevate that spark to the higher level of delight. In other words, to use that object, let's call it a pizza, l'shem shamayim, for the sake of heaven. In other words, using it in order to bring out the godliness within it, make it into a holy object. Now, not everything can be made into a holy object so easily, certainly not by every person, but the general concept is that physical delights are not in themselves anathema. You'll find, for instance, in Eastern religions, one of the great teachings, one of the central teachings, rather, of Eastern religions is that you're always striving to reach to the higher world and completely ignore and forget about this world. And that's why you can sit hours and hours in meditation and be an ascetic and fasting and so on and so forth, and not participate at all in this world. This is completely anathema to the Hasidic approach. This world is primary. Why is this world primary? The world is primary because this is where we've been placed. Why are we here? We're here for a duty. You wouldn't be here if you didn't have a duty to perform. What is that duty? That duty is to reveal the godliness that there is even in the physical world. This is particularly true after the whole concept of the tzimtzum. The tzimtzum was, we've spoken about it many times, the tzimtzum was the constriction of the divine light in order for the physical world to be created, for all the worlds, but the physical world in particular to be created. Divine light had to be concealed, at least to a certain extent concealed. And the same is true when it comes to the Sfirot. Let me just put up a chart of the Sfirot on the screen, and I will share a screen with you. Yeah, there we go. He has a chart of the Sfirot, as you can see. Starts with Keter, Chochmah, Bina. If you count Keter, you don't count Dat. If you count Dat, you don't count Keter, because Keter is a transcendent Sphira. So if we're counting the immanent Sfirot, then we go from there downwards. And that includes Dat, Chesed, Gvura, Tiferet, Netzachut, Yesod, and Malchut. All of these we've explained on a number of different occasions. If anyone wants a chart of these things and how they correspond to the powers of the soul, just drop me an email, kabbalahdecoded@gmail.com. Kabbalah with an H, Kabbalah decoded, Kabbalah decoded, one word, @gmail.com, and I'll send you a copy of the chart. In any event, the issue here is that the last of the Sfirot, the Sfira of Malchut, which is the lowest of the Sfirot, the final of the Sfirot, the female Sfira, believe it or not, the female Sfira, actually, I shouldn't say only the only one. Bina is also a female Sfira. Bina is called Ima, and Malchut is called the Bat, the daughter. Ima means mother, and Malchut is the daughter. Excuse me. So the problem is that all of the Sfirot up above pour their light, constricted light to a certain extent, through your sword into Malchut. But those lights are contained there, like very much like a fetus is contained in the womb of its mother. It's hidden from view. It might protrude a little bit or whatever it is, but you don't actually see the fetus itself, of course, unless you're looking on an X-ray or something like that, or ultrasound or whatever. But in any event, Malchut has this characteristic that it keeps things concealed within it. And there's a reason for that. The reason is that the lights within Malchut are not going to be revealed unless we do the action of revealing them. We have to go about depending on who we are, our personalities, what your soul is all about, you have to go and reveal those lights from within Malchut according to your station in life, according to your spiritual level, according to who and what you are. And that is part of the divine plan. The divine plan is that you don't get there's no free bread. Of course there is to a certain extent, but the expectation is that you're going to work for it. Initially there's free bread to get you going, but free bread, I mean, obviously not literally, but you're given a boost at the beginning in order to get you going, but then you have to work. You have to deserve, you have to earn what you get. You don't work, you don't get. That's just that's the rule. That's the way it works. So, what Korach wanted to do, Korach saw that all the lights are hidden in Malchut, and he came to the opinion, incorrectly, of course, he came to the opinion that why bother with eliciting and drawing down those lights from Malchut? Let's return their lights to their original source, where they're on a much higher level, and be done with the world. Who needs the world? Who needs the delights of the world? Who needs to reveal the godliness in the world? The godliness that there is in the higher spheres is so much greater. To a certain extent, what he said is correct. It makes sense. No free lunch, that's the word, yeah. To a certain extent, what he said makes sense. However, the intention of creation was that man should make a dwelling place for godliness in the lower world. If anyone wants to look this up, you can have a look at the work Tanya, which you can find on Chabad.org and many other places. Tanya, chapter 36 and 37, particularly 36, but going into chapter 37 as well, explains this in great detail, how the creation of this world is there for us to reveal godliness within it. And that was Korach's great error. His idea was, the word Korach is also related to the Hebrew word karcha, which means boldness. And the Levites were shaven, their heads were shaven, they were clean shaven on their heads. And what did this symbolize? To a certain extent, in Kabbalistic terminology, it symbolized the idea that the very small amount of light and energy that comes down through the hair, because the hair, don't forget, remains attached to the scalp, at least at a certain age anyway, until a certain age anyway, the hair remains attached to the scalp, and down that hair flows a certain amount of energy. In other words, the hair would fall out if that energy didn't keep it there. If it wasn't necessary, if it wasn't doing what it was. So the hairs represent, therefore, the hairs of the head and the hairs of the beard as well, represent the idea of drawing down from a higher level through a very constricted channel, but nevertheless drawing down light into the world. Now, again, Korach's father's name was Yitzhar. His father's name was associated with light. Now, what does light mean in the sense? Light means the inner dimensions of the Torah, the inner dimensions of teaching, the secret teachings of the Torah, or if you want to put it in this terminology, Kabbalah. The secret teachings, the mystical teachings, rather, secret is probably the wrong word, the mystical teachings of the Torah, which is Kabbalah. And that's what his father's name represented. So Korach felt that these mystical emanations should remain hidden from the populace. They should remain hidden from the physical world. They should not be revealed within the physical world, within the physical delights of this world. He was completely opposed to that. He said the heavens are the heavens for God, and earth is irrelevant. We don't need it. We don't want it around here. We don't want to have to deal with it. We want to remain in the spiritual world. We want to remain in the realms of the Levites were the tribe that served in the temple. So he wanted that life for the entire nation should be a life of devotion, a life of living and serving in the temple and not dealing with the world at all. That was his grave, grave error, because it's the exact opposite of what the divine intention was, as I mentioned before in Tanya, chapters 36 and 37. So that was his idea, that to make that separation. And Moses had to then go and heal that separation. He had to bring down to bring together the higher and the lower waters. In other words, the higher and the lower levels of delight, to be able to find delight even in the most simple and what should we call them? Gashmias, material things. And that is part of our mission. If one goes about one's life with an attitude of spirituality is all up there and there's nothing for me down here, that is completely the wrong attitude. On the contrary, finding the delight in this world expresses and gives rise to the expression of divine delight. And that is exactly why we do what we do. And that is the whole purpose of the commandments. All the commandments, almost all of the commandments, except those of the heart, which is very few of them, but all the commandments of the Torah, 613 of them, are focused on the physical world and doing something in the physical world. Like, for instance, tefillin phylacteries, kosher food, and so on and so forth. And this is the purpose of our existence to a very large extent, not to live in the higher worlds, but to bring the higher worlds down into the lower world and reveal that the lower world itself is in fact a higher world and will be revealed to be as such in the Messianic era, when the lower world, the godliness that's invested in the lower world will be fully revealed, and we will see that the lower world is in fact, it becomes inverted, that becomes the highest of the world. Okay, that is the basic concept that we learned from Rabbi Elimelech of Lizhensk. And if anyone has any questions, you're welcome to ask. Okay, doesn't seem to be any questions unless someone's typing, I don't know. Oh, so we love our enemies. Yes, that's what he was taught to. You don't love the enemy's actions. You don't love the enemy's evil, but you do love the spark that's in that enemy. And if you can reveal it to him himself or to her herself, there will be a changed person. Yes, you have to forgive, true. You have to forgive, but forgiveness is for the actions. Forgiveness doesn't necessarily change the person himself. There's forgiveness and there's things that cannot be forgiven. Forgiveness isn't a sort of a carte blanche and anything goes in terms of forgiveness. It's there are certain things that cannot be forgiven. It's not ours to forgive. Certain sins are sins in quotes are God's duty to forgive or not forgive, not ours. We can forgive people for harm that's done to us, for sure, but nevertheless, that's not necessarily going to change the person. What changes the person is to show him or her their own spark of godliness. And that's what Rabbi Elimelech of Lizhensk task was, the task that he was given by his master, the Maggid Mizrich. Yes. Okay, I hope that answers your question. Any other questions, please go ahead. Okay, don't seem to be any more. I'm not sure what's going to be next week. I might not even be in town. I might have to go out of town, but I will let you know in good time. All right, everybody, thank you, and have a wonderful weekend. And we'll see you again on the next occasion. All the best. Again, if you have any questions, you're welcome to write them in to kabbalahdecoded@gmail.com. Okay, all the best, guys. Good night, guys and girls. You're very welcome, everybody. All right. Good night now.